to seek again. Oh, my soul, you come and you go through the paths of time and space. In useless play, you'll not find the way, so set your course and go. Pray such a prayer with all your soul. You will never have to pray again. Die such a death at the feet of God. You will never have to die again. Oh, my soul, you come and you go through the paths of time and space. In useless play, you'll not find the way, so set your course and go. So set your course and go. So set your course and go. Breathe my love, breathe my love, breathe in the quiet center. Breathe my love, breathe my love, breathe in the quiet center. Breathe my love, breathe my love, breathe in the quiet center. Breathe my love, breathe my love, breathe in the quiet center. Oh, my soul, you come and you go through the paths of time and space. In useless play, you'll not find the way, so set your course and go. Oh, my soul, you come and you go through the paths of time and space. In useless play, you'll not find the way, so set your course and go. Oh, my soul, you come and you go through the paths of time and space. In useless play, you'll not find the way, so set.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to an inspirational evening, Last Breath, on this Giving Tuesday. I would first like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Silex people, where we learn, work, and play. Note, please silence your cell phones. Flash photography will be allowed this evening. I'm Kevin Rothwell, and I'll be your MC this evening. My wife and I have been friends of Sherman and Katie for a long time and share many fond memories of Emily. In May, I also joined the North Okanagan Hospice Society as the Fund Development and Communications Officer. I have a deep personal connection to hospice, as many people in our community do. Under the inspired leadership of our Executive Director, Lisa Matthews, we have very important work to do in our region. I say inspired because we have a leadership meeting every Wednesday morning, which is tomorrow. It's a day I sort of look forward to. I'm in awe of the talented women I work with who have more letters behind their name than I have in my name. The heart and brilliance is amazing. I received a phone call a few months ago from Sherman, and I could tell he was really excited about something. I knew he must have been finally watching television again and saw a documentary. And he was on a mission, and here we are tonight. Along the way, additional people were drawn to the idea. You will see most of them on stage tonight. I would like to acknowledge Destan Norris, who has been a friend of hospice on numerous occasions and has her own journey, which she often expresses in her artwork. Destan's work can be found in public, university, artist-run, and commercial galleries nationally and internationally. Her work is also found in private and corporate collections around the world, as well as in the permanent collection of the Alberta Foundation of the Arts and the Penticton Art Gallery. She has donated the original oil on panel Above It All 22, which will be auctioned during the Wine and Cheese tonight. Hospice currently is doing its Journeys fundraising campaign, and when I was looking for a quote, I came across this from our late Queen, who also affected many lives, and there was worldwide grief and sorrow there. She said, "Grief is the price we pay for love." Grief is the price we pay for love. So don't stop living and loving in fear of grief, because we need all the love in the world that we can get right now. Let's get the evening underway with a dance performance with Emmy and Avery from Accent Dance Studio. This special performance is entitled Hope. You will note one dancer is in black, representing despair, the other dancer in white, representing hope. Please welcome Emmy and Avery.
Somewhere, baby, it's part of me, part from me.
Avery and Emery. The Emily Dahl Foundation and Sky Volleyball are now going to present the 2022 scholarship to Nova Gardner.
Good evening. My name is Jeremy Wilson, and I'm the current president of Sky Volleyball Club here in Vernon. I'd like to thank Sherman, Katie, and the Emily Dahl Foundation for not only putting on this fantastic event, but also for all that you do for the community. So thanks for that. For those that don't know, Sky Volleyball Club is a nonprofit society that focuses on youth volleyball programming for the North Okanagan. In 2022, we've had 930 youth athletes participate in a variety of programming, including indoor club, smash ball, spring break camps, summer camps, and beach. Emily was special and a valued member of Sky Volleyball for a number of years. In her memory, Sherman approached us in 2021 with an unbelievable opportunity to start the Emily Dahl Foundation Scholarship, which awarded one of our graduating players from each season a $5,000 scholarship for post-secondary use. It goes without saying that a gift like that is special, and we have a huge impact on that recipient's future. I'd like to turn it now over to Troy Lawrenson, our past president of Sky Volleyball Club, to say a few words.
Thanks, Jeremy. I get the best job. I get to present this award to a special young woman. I changed my speech, if you want to call it that, on the way down from my house, on the way here. I was thinking tonight, really, the reason we're all here, the person who brought us here tonight, even though it seems like it's Sherman and the family and all the work that went into it, it really is Emily. She's the one who brought us here to this moment. And I know we have a lot of Sky kids here, so I thought I'd just share one quick story about Emily. I am Emily's former coach, one of many coaches, but I was privileged to coach her for a couple of seasons. She was our captain, very special to me. And the story I want to share, you might think has to do with maybe a win, a big championship, but it's not. The story I remember most about Emily is our final tournament together. Emily severely sprained her ankle at Nationals. And that was a huge loss for our team as our team captain, but I'll never forget this moment because we were in the gold medal match and I was sitting by myself like I normally do as a coach. Emily came over and sat down beside me right before the match started. And she was in her, with her crutches. Normally she'd stand up by the other girls cheering her teammates on, but she just sat with me. She stuck her hand on my shoulder. We looked at each other, and I just remember we both just started bawling uncontrollably. It was just a special moment, and it was nothing to do that it was, her not being able to be on the court. It was all about this realization that that was our last match together after all the time we had spent together. So the message really I take from that is I just want the kids here to know that you have to enjoy every moment with your teammates. It's not about X's and O's, wins and losses, even though those are important. Don't get me wrong. I love to win too. But it's really those bonding memories with your teammates that you're going to remember. So that's the thing I carry with me with Emily. That was our last time together on the court. I spent lots of hours with Sherman in the volleyball world and got to know Emily very well. And she's still with me today. The recipient of this year's award could not be a better choice. I happen to be Nova's coach as well, and they share a lot of similar qualities. Nova is a steely competitor. We nickname her Ice Woman. Those of you who played with her know she just never gets nervous. I'm sure she's nervous, but she hides it very well. So both Emily and Nova obviously are talented. They were both captains of my teams. But the quality that they share most is just the kindness toward their teammates. Everyone loved to play with Emily. Everyone loves to play with Nova. She just simply makes her teammates better. And she lights up the court. That's probably the best way to describe it. When Nova's on the court, she just brightens it with her smile and her kindness. So that's really what we look for, number one quality to receive this award is, are you a great teammate? Are you kind? Do your teammates look up to you? Look to you for leadership, but mostly, do you love the sport and being around your teammates? So Nova, congratulations. Couldn't be happier. For the Gardner family, you raised a lot of great kids. I can say all your kids be deserving of this award because they're all kind. And Sky Kids, this is really what it's all about, is the qualities that Nova represents. So here you go, Nova. Thank you.
Congratulations. Next, I would like to introduce for a few short comments the Executive Director of the North Okanagan Hospice Association, Lisa Matthews.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Matthews, and I'm the Executive Director of the North Okanagan Hospice Society. We are honored to be here tonight and to be able to partner with the Emily Dahl Foundation to bring you tonight's program and these inspiring stories. We would like to thank the Emily Dahl Foundation, the respected speakers, the artists, and you, the community, for being here tonight and providing support to both North Okanagan Hospice and the Emily Dahl Foundation on this Giving Tuesday. We would also like to thank Avery and Emery for their amazing performance of the dance Hope, and Disdain Norris for the painting donated to this cause. At North Okanagan Hospice, the work we do centers around the topics such as dying, loss, and grief, whose themes will be discussed here tonight. Our organization sees this as a unique opportunity to hear stories and create more conversations around grief and dying, to try to decrease the stigma and the mystery around something that, to all of us, is as sure as taxes. At Hospice, we work with people facing their own death every day, but often the hardest part of this journey is the one that takes place between the clients and their loved ones and their ability to talk about death and what happens next, the stigma of death. We can see the discomfort on how to bring it up because these conversations about death and dying are, as one of our nurses put it, so scary and honest and raw. Our clients themselves are often ready for death, but they worry about who they're leaving behind and the impact of this life-changing event, their death, on their loved ones. These are the hardest conversations, and they're made even harder when the death is unexpected. What can we do to help people move through this painful experience? Well, we believe stories like the ones we're going to hear tonight and the conversations that they create as a result of it will help. We are also appreciative that we are able to use an avenue such as this to draw on the rare ability of the arts to express feelings in ways that words sometimes simply cannot. And also to help reduce the stigma and allow for safe opportunities to increase discussions. Thank you for this opportunity to move these conversations forward. We hope you all enjoy the evening. I know I will. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And before we get to one of the gentlemen that, the gentleman that was responsible for putting this together, we would really like to thank the Hospice Association, or Society, and Emily Dahl Foundation. Would like to thank our event sponsors, Cal Tire, National Bank Financial, Brown Mechanical Services, Castanet Media, Community Foundation of the North Okanagan, High Pro Corporate Sportswear and Promotional Products, IA Wealth Management, the Italian Kitchen Company, Pure Country 105.7, Summit Specialty Foods, and Vance Creek Hotel and Conference Center at Silver Star Mountain Resort. And now please welcome from the Emily Dahl Foundation, Sherman Dahl.
I went back there looking for my water. I always have her with me. Nice little picture of Emily. We're actually ahead of schedule. That means I can talk for 30 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. So we're in for a real treat tonight, and Chris is going to walk us through his story, so I have nothing to say. I thought this slide was a good example of the purpose of the Emily Dahl Foundation, and part of my goal tonight is to talk a little bit about the main points of the Emily Dahl Foundation and the purpose of our life. And I guess ultimately as well is to ask a significant question, which is, who am I? And I would also recommend that this isn't a question you walk around asking other people, because they'll ask you to go on a couch. It was an amazing story. I was in LA only a couple weeks ago, and some people may have heard of this story, and I thought of it because I was in airports, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm finding airports to be wonderful places. They got palm trees and bars and couches you can lay on, and so I just don't understand why people get so upset. But then my flight was about 3 hours late. But there was a great story on the internet where a gentleman that had missed his flight, and he was at the counter, and he was very upset. And he said to the lady running the counter, he says, I need to get on this flight like right now. She says, well, I'm sorry, sir, but all these people are waiting. They're getting on the same flight. He said, do you know who I am? So she picked up the microphone and said, ladies and gentlemen, we have someone here that doesn't know who he is. I thought that was pretty good. So like I said, this isn't a question you walk around asking other people. You have to ask yourself. This is an immense question which is related to what the purpose of life is. And I got these 3 beautiful women in my life. Don't you think maybe God was a woman? And don't you think that perhaps there's a divinity within all of us that you might be able to find by asking that question, who am I? Someone said to me, maybe a couple times in my life, that I'm made in the image of God. I said, this thing? This frail body? I think we need to look a little bit deeper. And I don't think that I'm the only one that thinks that. And, they say that fools argue and wise people discuss and listen. I think that makes us all wise people, right? We're all here and seeking together sort of a deeper truth. And maybe that's why Chris's story started to resonate with me, is, sort of the depths of the ocean of who we are is a question that we should be asking ourselves. So let's dive deep together. And I know, Kevin and all these wonderful people that have put this together. And if you guys don't know, that's my mother on the right, my beautiful wife in the middle, and my lovely daughter. And in many ways, really we're just getting started. And someone said, well, some of these things you're talking about, these dreams and wishes these are big things. I think it was the Dalai Lama said, well, if you don't think small things can make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito. So I'm very happy to be here with all of you and asking some of these bigger questions about life. So I'm going to keep it simple, well, maybe not too simple, but give you a few of my thoughts from the Emily Dahl Foundation. I said this early on, and I think I've talked to many parents, many others that have experienced loss. And I think if we were to all raise our hands, who's lost a loved one, there's nobody in here that hasn't. And I think that when you lose a loved one, your energy, which obviously there's grief, but ultimately your energy to turn to fulfilling the wishes of the person that's passed away. And really, if we think of what was Emily seeking, was happiness and purpose in her life. And that showed in everything that she did, as you heard from some of her close friends. Where's all the Sky volleyball people? Shouldn't you be yelling, "Hi, go Sky"? So to this day, I just continue to hear wonderful stories like the one that Troy told tonight. I might have heard that one, but it's just amazing, the energy and the enthusiasm and the love and the happiness and the compassion that she shared. So if we're going to fulfill her wishes, it's talking about the purpose of our life and the deeper meaning of true happiness. So what is the purpose of life? And it's amazing to me, and it was probably amazing to Emily, that a lot of people don't seem to know. And those of us that do ask the question sometimes get the wrong answer. And common sense would kind of say that, we probably should understand why we're here. There's a really well-known lady. She expanded on some work that was done in 1966, which is the year that I was born. Her name was Susan Whitbourne. And, I must add, I had a wonderful coffee with Stan Eamon, who's become a friend of mine, and Laurie Thomas, who's also become a good friend of mine. And, the energy in that room, we sat at the top of the bean scene with Chris, and I'm pretty sure we were glowing. And it was like there was only two people on the whole top of the bean scene. It was just an unbelievable conversation where, Stan said something stunning, was just the amount of good that has come out of something that was a bit of a mess. And that to me was a very strong point. But anyway, this Susan Whitbourne, she's still a professor of psychology at the University of Massachusetts. I think she's been practicing for 40 years. I'm just going to read from one of her quotes she did. She expanded on this study from 1966. And some of these things are valid today. And Chris and I were talking about that earlier, like wars all over the world. I think miles from where Chris lives, like they're slaughtering people. Like, it's just amazing. So here's what she wrote. She did extensive research up until now, and here's what she said. She found that human beings worldwide have lost a sense of personal meaning. They're working more, but they're far more full of despair. Despair. Why? She goes on to say, so many people are seeking fulfillment, but never find it. She tested and found people are desperately seeking to find personal meaning in their lives. She found these same symptoms in all groups, not just Tiger Woods. We can point to certain parts of societies, the yuppies, people that are, clearly living an illusionary life, but that's not the case. It's across all age groups. She found the same symptoms in all groups, not only the ones that are in obvious illusion. And then she went on to say that the scores on life satisfaction are so low that they could not go any lower. That's pretty amazing. So it would seem that people do not know what the purpose of life is. So the answer might be tough, but I think it's there. And it's true that we're all outwardly different. We all have different roles to play. But underneath it all, is there something that's common to all of us? Is there something that we truly desire, that we truly want? And I think there is. I think ultimately we all want freedom from suffering. We want eternal joy. We want wisdom, compassion. We want all those sorts of things. Now, where in the world do you find that? Well, what's interesting is both those things are not available in the external world. I was listening to a remarkable set of little clips. Everybody here, does anybody remember Art Linklater? Kids say the darndest things. Leah, you'll be interested to know he was born in Moose Jaw. He actually ended up passing away in Hollywood, but he lived in Moose Jaw. And this one was just incredible, and I've encountered some stories like this in Wings, and when we have little kids in there, and he was interviewing this 6-year-old little boy, and he did these sort of candid interviews with little kids. So he said to the little boy, he said, "Have you done anything exciting this week?" He said, "Yes. Yesterday I had my 6th birthday party, and I had cake, and I had cookies, I had milk, and I had candies, and then I threw up." So sometimes in a nutshell, that kind of sums up our life in the external world. But amazingly, here we are all seeking together. And this is powerful. It's very positive. A little heavy, isn't it? So what's the answer? Well, we're going to let Chris sort of talk to you about that kind of stuff. Maybe save it for another day. And I'm going to leave you with one final thought. There's an amazing quote in the Bhagavad Gita, which was, I think, 2,000 years ago, and and very similar things actually showed up in the Bible. You just got to search for it in some of the wording. And I thought it was a wonderful analogy using, I brought a turtle with me. Katie and I has these carved for us in Maui about a month ago. And here's the quote, quote unquote, Bhagavad Gita, 2,000 years ago. "One who is able to withdraw his senses from sense objects as the turtle draws its limbs within the shell is firmly fixed in perfect consciousness." So it would seem that you got to go within. So I've got a theory, because Chris often wonders how he survived this thing. I say, well, Chris, he's not a man, he's a turtle. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to me, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Sherman. As I said, people were added along the way that were attracted to what was going on tonight. And one of those people is becoming a fast friend. She is from Saskatoon. We, of course, have the Riders in common. The area of the province where her son played hockey is also very close. It's an area where my dad was raised, and he played hockey, junior hockey, in that area as well. Would you please welcome to the stage Lori Thomas.
Good evening, everyone. Sherman, that's a tough act to follow, as usual. I'd like to thank Sherman and Katie and the Emily Dahl Foundation for inviting me to introduce Chris tonight. When Sherman asked, I knew I needed to be here, and I've been able, over the last couple of days, get to know Sherman better, get to know Katie better, meet Chris, and understand more about Emily. I know Chris is going to speak tonight about his time spent on the bottom of the North Sea and what he experienced for 36 minutes when his umbilical cord was cut and his oxygen tank was running low. What did he go through in those minutes alone and thinking about his loved ones? Folks, he should not be alive today to discuss his experience, but he is. Before I bring Chris to the stage for his presentation, I would like to take a few minutes and discuss who I am and why I'm on stage tonight. As I was introduced, my name is Lori Thomas, and my son, Evan Walker Thomas, was one of the Humboldt Broncos who unfortunately didn't make it home on Friday night, April 6th, when the team was traveling to Nipawin for Game 5 of playoffs, and the bus collided with a semi-trailer. Evan was one of the 16 that died that day. As I stand here tonight, I ask you to take a breath. When the Humboldt Broncos bus crashed with the semi-trailer, Evan had one breath. He was standing up, putting on his suit. And as his mom, I ask, what were his last 60 seconds on this earth? Did he know how much I loved him, his dad loved him, and his sister loved him, and that we would miss him dearly? I ask all of you to think about your time on this earth and what it means. As Sherman said, the purpose to be happy and grateful. My son Evan was a hockey player. He was a very humble kid, and he was a great teammate. He was a bright light who was smart, funny, he loved to laugh, and not all understood his sense of humor. My family has been through a lot these last 4.5 years, and I will speak briefly about grief in this journey and how we all have our own road. There are so many things I could talk about, how thankful we were for the love and the support we received in the aftermath of the crash, and we still continue to receive today. We know now every day is a gift on this earth, and our family has chosen to do what we can to keep Evan's legacy alive and be a positive influence in the world, just as Sherman's family is with Emily, and so too is Chris here being with us tonight. One of the tough conversations our family always has is watching the young men that were on the bus with Evan that day, his preschool friends, and he had so many, along with many of his hockey and his baseball buddies. And we always think, what would Evan be doing today in this moment, now that he's 23? But our family was frozen in time that day with him when he died at 18 years of age, gone too quickly, just as Emily is. This breaks our hearts, but then I hear him say, "Mom, I'm flying high above with Grandpa E," which is my father, the boys on the bus, coaches Darcy and Mark, bus driver Glenn, and Dana. And I truly believe Evan and Emily have connected to help the Dahl and the Thomas family come together. I came to know Sherman in March of 2019 at an industry conference in Toronto. A mutual friend introduced us. I remember Dev saying, "Lori, you need to talk to Sherman as you both have lost a loved one." Sherman and I didn't ask to belong to this club, but we've chosen to honor the legacy of Emily and Evan by giving back and doing all we can to keep their memory alive. I ask everyone tonight to take a breath, be thankful, tell those in your life how much you love them, and always be grateful for each day, because you don't know what tomorrow will bring and how fast it can change in one breath. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my true pleasure and honor to introduce Chris and to bring him to stage. And I hope, if you have not watched it already, that after Chris's presentation, you will watch his documentary on Netflix called Last Breath and what he went through. Thank you.
That structure to appear. Then it appeared.
So pretty harrowing stuff, but you can relax a little because he makes it. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to Laurie for that very charming introduction. It's been a very sort of perspective-giving couple of days, spending time with both Laurie and with Sherman and Katie. Really, really interesting to spend some time with them. So thank you to Laurie for that. And thank you, of course, to Sherman and to Katie and to Natasha for firstly facilitating my coming along today, but also for being so incredibly hospitable and looking after me so well. It's been a real honor to spend some time with you. So thank you very much. I'm also going to thank the sponsors because, as I'm sure you all know, these kind of things can't happen without them. So I need to thank Carl Tire. I understand they're sponsoring the cheese and wine, so they're my particular favourites. The National Bank Financial, Brown Mechanical Services, Castanet, the North Okanagan Community Foundation, the Hypro Corporate Sportswear, IA Private Wealth, the Italian Kitchen Company, Pure County Radio, Summit Specialty Foods, and Vance Creek Hotel and Conference Area. So thank you very much to them for making this happen, A little caveat on thanking Sherman, which I just did, obviously, but I don't know if I'd misheard backstage, but it sounded conspicuously like he was expecting me to, explain the meaning of life to you. I swing a hammer for a living, really, so I don't know if I've quite got that in me, but I'll do my best to enlighten a little bit. But thank you also to you for coming along. It's it's very flattering, really. I appreciate the vast majority of you here to support Emily and the foundation. So, as am I. So, but thank you very much for attending. It's been lovely as well, spending time with the Dahls and learning about Emily and hearing about her life and what a remarkable young lady she quite obviously was. And I'm sure it's testament to her that so many of you have been kind enough to come along tonight and continue supporting the family and the foundation. So I'm sure she'd be very grateful, and I'm sure they are as well. Before I really start properly, I always sort of apologise, which is kind of my nature anyway, to be honest. But I always feel somewhat of a charlatan, I think, that I'm stood in front of you and I'm talking about something where I'm reasonably well and healthy. And I always feel that the story I have to tell, and it is just a story really, would probably be better told by the true heroes involved, with the people who came to get me and rescued me. But it does fall to me sometimes, but that's just the way it is. So, I'm here really as a representative, I think, of them and the amazing people involved. People often have lots of questions. I think my understanding is that at the end of this, Sherman and I are going to sit down and have a bit of a chat, and we'll ask some questions. But I will definitely be around for the cheese and wine. So if you've got anything to ask, feel free to approach. Don't be shy. Okay, let's get on with this. I'm going to quickly start by telling you a little bit about what I do, really, because it's kind of a strange world that I work in. People don't necessarily know too much about it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what saturation diving is, because that's my job, a little bit about my life in saturation and the job of a saturation diver. Really just to give some context to the story that I'm going to tell you, which is something that happened, as you saw there briefly, about just over 10 years ago, in fact. And then I'm going to finish up by hopefully giving you a few insights, I suppose, into things that I and we reflected on after it happened, really, and some of the lessons that we learned. I'm not going to dwell too much on that. So, to the nitty-gritty. So I'm a commercial diver, and that is exactly what it sounds like, which means I'm completely mercenary and I just dive for money. People have a vision of what that might be. I certainly did when I took the decision to become a diver. It was something along these lines. It transpires the reality is a bit more like that, yeah. I will say that's not me. I don't know why his thumbs up either. I think he's got absolutely zero to celebrate there. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that it's not really a particularly glamorous profession. It's pretty mundane most of the time. It has little moments where you kid yourself that you're a spaceman, but most of the time it's pretty drudgerous work, yeah. But I do a very specific type of diving called saturation diving. And I'm going to explain to you a little bit about what that is, as I said, to try and give you a bit of context to the story. And to do that, I'm going to go back to basics. I'm sure we've got scuba divers in the room. All these beautiful lakes you've got around us. Yeah, there we go. So apologies if this is your speciality, and I'm going to bore you a little bit. But I'm sure we all know that if you go diving, if you drop down in this little example, we're going to call him Sherman for no particular reason, and we ask a diver to go down to, say, 30 meters for about 30 minutes. You pay a penalty for that in terms of the gases, and in particular the inert gases that you absorb into the tissues of your body. So in the case of air diving, you're absorbing nitrogen into your system. And if you were to ascend too quickly, those bubbles basically of nitrogen which have passed into your tissues would expand as the pressure is reduced. They would rupture tissues, they would block veins and arteries, and in the worst case, they would block the flow of oxygen to the brain and stop, and cause death. So that's what we call decompression sickness, or the bends. So to avoid that, most divers are fairly sensible, and they will therefore take their time to ascend to the surface. In this example, they might stop for about 10 minutes at, say, 3 meters. I'm just making this up, to be honest, but something like that. To allow those inert gases to pass safely and in a controlled fashion out of their tissues into the bloodstream and be breathed out, okay? When he's done that, he would then get back up to the surface to prepare his next speech. Okay. What if we want to dive deeper? So where I work, we work all over the world really, but principally in the North Sea at the moment, and that involves diving significantly deeper than is safe to do so on air, because there are 3 principal dangers to breathing air diving deeper, and I'm going to go through those briefly for you. First of those is something called nitrogen narcosis, which obviously involves the nitrogen in the air that we breathe. Once you get below about, I do everything in meters, sorry, so I'm going to have to convert on the fly, but about 90 feet, say, 99 feet maybe. It varies from person to person in its severity and the depth that you start to feel it, but it's really just a slight feeling of intoxication. Has a narcotic effect, the nitrogen, so it's not dissimilar to drinking, a nice whiskey. It's not an unpleasant sensation particularly. But if you continue to go deeper, if you spend longer, or the longer you spend down there, the more significant that sort of narcosis becomes, and it can lead to really poor decision making. So I would never encourage you to do so, but if you went on YouTube, you'd find videos of the divers who are larking about at 50 meters, having a good time, smiling, joking, and then they make a poor decision, they decide to go deeper, and they don't come back. So it's a significant problem that needs to be overcome. The second problem, if you like, involves the second gas in the mix, or the second major gas in the mix, air, which is oxygen, and I'm going to show you a little slightly scary video.
This 1940s film from the US Navy shows the effects of breathing oxygen under pressure. As more oxygen is forced into the bloodstream, it quickly becomes toxic. The effects are debilitating and incredibly painful, and eventually, though not in this case, fatal. So at depth, where the gas has to be under pressure, the only way to stop the oxygen becoming toxic is to reduce the amount of it we breathe.
He's fine, by the way, but another volunteer probably regretted his decision, I suspect. Yeah, so it can cause, similar to the nitrogen, when you get past about 90 feet, something like that, it can, particularly if you stay down there for a long time, the pressurized oxygen become toxic in your system, and it can cause convulsions and things like that. So obviously on a perfectly human level, we can't have that. We don't want to see people in any danger, but also from a commercial perspective, we can't have divers lying on the bottom jiggling around. It's just not practical. The third, and actually the most significant barrier to diving deeper, bringing air, is actually that of time. To do that, I'm going to come back to our friend Sherman. He's changed suits this time, and this time we're going to ask him to go much deeper. We're going to ask him to go down to 100 metres. That's sort of pretty typical depth where I work. And we're also going to ask him to stay down there for 6 hours, because that's how long I spend every day on the seabeds, about 6 hours at a time. So normally it's sort of ask the audience, but I'm not really into that kind of thing. So I'll just tell you how long it takes. So I'm going to ask you, to think. We talked about 10 minutes perhaps of decompression in that previous example. So in this example, how long do you think it might take you to ascend safely to the surface? And it's usually varying answers, but I'll tell you the actual answer is about 4 days. So an extremely long time. That's not practical on two levels. You can't really ask human beings to hang on the end of a rope for 4 days. They're definitely going to get hungry. And also from a commercial perspective, my vessel costs something in the region of about, I'll do dollars now, and I'd say $250,000 a day to rent. Clients are not going to really accept people hanging around on ropes while nothing's getting done. So a significant problem that needs to be overcome. You're all educated people. I'm sure you're solution makers. So people who are much cleverer than me have come up with 3 solutions that I'm going to go through. The first one is a solution to the problem of nitrogen narcosis, and I'm going to step aside and let someone far more attractive than I am explain to you why.
Perhaps tell from my pasty skin and my slightly unruly beard, I've been in this tank now for 28 days. But I just thought I'd quickly explain to you about how we've solved the problem of nitrogen and the narcotic effect that it has. As you can perhaps tell by the tone of my voice, it's replaced with another inert gas, helium, which is just as easy to breathe, but has the unfortunate side effect of giving this ridiculous voice, which, whilst it's funny perhaps for 5 minutes, trust me, the novelty soon wears off, and it can make conversations with anybody at home very difficult, and particularly if you're trying to pay a gas bill or speak to the bank manager.
I've not actually been in that system for nearly 2 years, and my face is still as pasty, I've noticed. So it's just, that's just living in Scotland, I'm afraid. So, as he says there, we have a very simple solution to the problem of the nitrogen narcosis, which is we just replace the nitrogen in the gas. So we replace it with helium, which has a benefit of being very light, very easy to breathe. The principal downside is it's very, very expensive. It's quite a finite resource on Earth. It's used by the medical industry quite a lot. And therefore, that's one of the reasons that saturation diving is a very expensive way of doing a relatively simple thing. The second solution, if you like, is to solve the problem of the oxygen toxicity. It's very simple in itself again, in terms of we just simply alter the volume of oxygen we have in the mix. So that sounds odd perhaps, but if you're going to be diving down to maybe 200 meters, you might be breathing as little as 2% oxygen, which obviously if I were to breathe that here on the surface would knock me out unconscious pretty quickly, pretty much instantaneously in fact. But at that depth, due to the miracle of pressure and partial pressures, which I'm not going to bore you with too much today, probably mostly because I don't understand it, it's the equivalent of breathing more than 21% oxygen on the surface. So you're actually in an oxygen-rich environment, high oxygen content we'd be breathing here. So that volume of oxygen or that percentage of oxygen varies according to the depth you're working at. The third solution, that to solve the problem of time, is the most convoluted of the three, and it really goes a long way, I think, to explaining what I do for a living, really. The vessel you can see behind me there is called the Topaz. It's actually the vessel I still work on to this day, nearly 10 years later. And she's what we call a dive support vessel. Now, she is about 110 meters long, I think, weighs about 8,000 tons. She's got a couple of big cranes on her. But to all intents and purposes, she looks like a pretty standard supply vessel you might see in any offshore environment, just a pretty normal ship, really. But at our heart is what we call the saturation system, and that really is a thing that explains what I do and how we circumnavigate the problem of time. So this is a series of decompression chambers, so long steel cylinders which, sit in the very bottom and the centre of the ship in the most stable part of the vessel. That's the diving bell. We'll come back to that in a second. That's our sort of taxi to work, really. But the chambers are, on the Topaz, we have about 7 interlinked chambers, some for living in, some for working from. And essentially on day one of a trip to work, we would go through the door you can see behind you, and that door would then be closed. We go in as 12 divers, so 4 teams of 3. Each team of 3 are there to cover 6 hours on the seabed to facilitate the vessel diving 24 hours a day. And once we're in, we close the door and we pressurise the system down. So we basically pump gas into those chambers to what we call an equivalent working depth. So if you give an example of working at 100 metres like we did, you'd probably be pressurised down to about 90 metres. So 90 metres of gas is pumped into the chambers. And once you're there, that takes maybe an hour or two to do it safely. Once you're in there, you basically stay and live under those conditions. So you eat, you sleep, you drink. Everything else we do as human beings is done within those chambers under pressure. And each day this diving bell, which you can see returning, this is actually it coming back to the system rather than leaving, so it's coming up out of the water. And you'll see it trolley across and drop down onto what we call the hub, so the blue sort of circle there, that leads down into the chamber system below. But normally we would climb up into that. The door, we'd close as a team of 3, the door would be closed of the diving bell beneath us, ours is on the floor, and the pressure would be removed between the two, between the diving bell and the system. You're then separated from that chamber system, you're lifted up, trolleyed across and down through that hole in the vessel we call the moon pool, and lowered down to, in this example, 90 metres. And once you get to 90 metres, because you've got an equivalence of pressure inside, so you've got 90 metres of pressure in the bell, got 90 metres of water pressure outside, when we open that bottom door again, the water doesn't come in, so you've got a dry environment from which to dive, basically. You then don a diving helmet, you say your prayers, and you jump out. And once you're out in the water, you then drop in this example, about 10 metres down to the seabed. You work for 6 hours. During those 6 hours, you're attached at all times by an umbilical cord, which we'll come back to in a bit more detail, which Laurie mentioned there briefly. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It's really just a giver of life, thus the name. It provides us with an essentially infinite supply of breathing gas. It provides us with hot water, which we flood our suits with to keep us warm in very cold conditions. It also provides us with power to power a light and a camera on the top of our heads. And also we have an extra hose which returns that helium, that heliox gas that we breathe. Because it's so expensive, we actually suck it back up to the vessel, clean it up, add oxygen, recycle it, and reuse it to keep our usage down. Once you've done your 6 hours on the seabed, you then climb back up into the diving bell. We close the door. We're hoisted back up to the vessel, locks back onto the system exactly as you saw there, and then we drop down and have a cup of tea, basically, read a book, have a shower, go to bed, and you get up the next day and repeat. And you repeat the process every single day. In the UK, we're restricted to 28 days at a time living within those chambers. So in this example, after 24 days, you would stop diving and you basically stay in the safety of the chamber while you spend those 4 days decompressing back to the surface, which basically just means leaking the gas out very, very slowly and in a very controlled fashion. So what you're doing in essence is one dive. You're doing a 28-day long dive, really. So you only decompress one time in a controlled situation. And whilst you're decompressing, another team can be put in there to take your place, and the work never needs to stop. So I hope that sort of briefly tells you what to do and explains it, gives you a bit of context. That's a pretty typical saturation system. That's not the one from my vessel, but you can see there you've got 4 living chambers where people are living, and then here you've got the 2 diving bells. The Topaz does have 2 bells. The main advantage of that is that it facilitates continuous work. So when you've got a team on the seabed working for 6 hours, just before their 6 hours is up, the next team will come down in the other diving bell, and you pretty much high five on the bottom and they take over. So nothing ever needs to stop. But more importantly, it actually serves as a rescue bell. So if in the event of an emergency with the first bell, the second bell can be dispatched to help out. The other thing you can see on both sides are things that look like lifeboats, principally because they are. And they are slightly different in that you have one of these chambers inside them. And as you can see, there's a sort of tunnel on either side linking up to them. And that's all remains under pressure at all times. So in the event of an emergency, such as the ship sinking or on fire or anything like that, the worst case scenario really is that you find yourself on the seabed when something like this happens. That process of coming back to the ship in the bell takes about 35 to 40 minutes on our vessel. So first of all, you've got to hope that there's people hung around to bring you back. Then you'll have to sort of drop down, take your clothes off, run up into the lifeboat, hope that they've waited for you, hope that there are people outside to launch you. It's one of these, it doesn't really bear thinking about, to be honest. I think we've mitigated, but goodness, God forbid. This is saturation control. So as I said, we've got a huge cast of characters on our boat that are there really just to put 2 divers on the seabed every day. Probably the most important ones from our perspective, what we call the life support team, and they are there really to regulate the gases that we breathe. That gas mixture we touched upon earlier on, that is vital, but that's correct at all times because you can poison people, kill people very quickly if it isn't. But also there to regulate other gases like the build-up of carbon dioxide, the humidity, the temperature of the chambers, and also to facilitate having 12 guys or girls in there. They need their washing done, they need food bringing. We have a little menu that we fill out every day, which they then collect the food for the galley for us and lock it into the chambers through sort of airlocks. So a vital part of the team, not only keeping us alive, but keeping us fed. From a working perspective, this is from the Topaz. So we have 2 of these. This is what we call dive control. There's one of these for the port bell and one for the starboard bell. And it looks fairly complicated, but really what we do is we have somebody that sat there every day. In the case of the story I'm going to tell you is actually a Canadian, which probably tells you everything you need to know. But his role really is to direct the dive. He has a constant and open line of communication down to the divers on the seabed. We've got earpieces in our helmets, and he can talk to us continuously. He will not only keep us alive via the gases that he's sending down to us, but he's also there to feed us our work scope and our procedures and things like that. And give us a line of communication to the surface. This, motley crew. I show you that only really not because we're all handsome devils, but because that's within the diving bell. And as you can see already, by the time you've put 3 divers in there, their umbilicals, all the pipe work, the working equipment, the safety equipment, it's already very, very claustrophobic and cramped place to be. Just closing that bottom door when we're coming back to the surface or we're leaving the vessel requires you to pretty much Spider-Man yourself onto the wall just to allow you to put it down. And that's when we're all conscious, which obviously we're coming on to. So a difficult environment to work at the best of times, but particularly difficult in the event of any kind of emergency. Okay, again, I'm going to ask someone more eloquent than me to explain to you a little bit about life in saturation. Hello boys. Obviously as you can see there's not a huge deal of space, probably only half a foot or so between the bunks down here. Dunk's in there getting his ready, and then this is the living end. Got sort of benches and a bit of a table. One of the very few portholes we've got, so that's pretty much the only sight of the outside world that you have. So I've got to crawl through these little tunnels to get from place to place. And down this way is what we call the wet pot. So I just push that door open. Basically the toilet and the shower room, so various ablutions and that kind of thing. Yeah, if I stand my full height, there's absolutely everything that can knock my head on. It's a real pain for me. That's why I've always got gashes all over me. And the magic of it is, once you've done the full circuit, you're back to where you started. And a cup of tea. And a cup of tea.
Miami chocolate stash.
That's ridiculous, Duncan. How much have you got in there?
Just a bar for every day.
A bar for every day.
I've only started just to check them out. Yeah.
I'm glad I'm in with you. That's the lovely Duncan, who we'll come on to later. But yeah, a strange place to work, obviously. I will say that the diving is actually probably the easy part of the job. The most difficult part of the working in that environment is having to live in very close confines with people you might normally cross the road to avoid, to be honest. If you value your privacy in any way, forget it. It's not going to be for you. You pretty much have to, as you might see there briefly, ask someone to turn the shower on for you. You're on film all the time, just supposedly for your safety, but I'm not really sure it's entirely necessary, you know. Think what you will, sort of thing. If you need to flush the toilet, you've got to ask somebody to do that. You also need to be able to deal psychologically with the fact that there is no escape from there. That 4 days of decompression that I talked about earlier on, that can't be circumnavigated in any situation. You know, if your mother were to die, if your appendix were to burst, so on and so forth, that still can't be circumnavigated. So you need to be able to deal psychologically with that. And obviously, we've got practical sort of things we can do to try and help ourselves. But you really need to be somebody who can deal with the fact that once that door is shut, there is essentially no escape. We have an analogy that it's quicker to get back from the moon, but that's mainly to flatter sort of divorcees in Aberdeen into thinking we're interesting. You need to be able to tie your shoelaces to be an astronaut. It's not really a prerequisite of being a diver, to be honest. But yeah, a difficult place to work. Okay, last bit of boring stuff really before we get to the meat and gravy of all this. Really just again to give you some context to the story, we talked a little bit about the living environment there, but in order to facilitate working on the seabed, which is where we spend most of our time, it's essential that the vessel, the boat, is able to stay in one position directly above you, because as I said, we're attached at all times by an umbilical cord. So if the vessel were to move, you go with it basically. So in order to allow you to work in one place and on one job, that vessel needs to be able to hold station. You would assume that we would maybe drop anchors, but generally it's too deep or there are too many valuable assets on the seabed to risk doing that. So, and also we have to move around a lot. So, you know, we have this, what we call a dynamic positioning system, which is basically a computer which sits on the bridge of the boat. It uses various references, so it uses GPS, it uses beacons that we place on the seabed, what we call taut wires, which are weighted lines whose angle of inclination as the vessel moves around is fed back to these computers, and it takes all this information in, and we have various thrusters, propellers around the boat, which it can, the computer then instructs to counteract the effect of the wind and the waves and the tide. And it really is a remarkable system in terms of holding it in one place. I can be on the seabed with a 30-ton load on the end of a crane, and I can ask the boat to move, 13 meters on 47 degrees, and it'll do that very, very smoothly and very accurately, and in all but the worst of weather. So it's a great system when it works, which we'll come to in a minute. This is the same thing illustrated in very poor childish graphics, but just to give you an idea, you can see there we've dropped that bell down. We usually have a golden rule that we don't drop it anywhere nearer than 5 meters above anything subsea, because were that bell to catch on anything, it would effectively be an anchor for the boat, which we don't want. And then diver 1 would jump out, drop down to the seabed to start his 6 hours working, closely followed, hopefully, unless he's got the heebie-jeebies, by diver 2. And he would drop down and work. We work in a team of 3, as I mentioned, so we always have one diver who remains in the diving bell every single day. It's a position we rotate, so everyone takes a turn every 3rd day to put their feet up and eat a sandwich, or they'll manage the gases, sorry. Okay, and then, really just to polish this off, some people are sometimes curious about what we do when we're actually down there. It's quick footage of this is much of the footage I'm going to show you tonight. Some's in the film if some of you have seen it, but it's pretty much all actual footage from either the vessel or from the actual night of the incident I'm going to tell you about, because we do have these cameras on our heads. But yeah, every day we sort of climb up in there and then close the door and drop down to the seabed, as I mentioned. And what work do we actually do? Little as possible. But I work almost exclusively in the oil and gas industry, so people often assume really that means, first of all, I was going to say it's a very ethereal and strange place to work, obviously. We wear Wellington boots, we're not really swimming around very often, and you're working in this dark and, say, scary place because you get used to it, but it's obviously a very unusual and sometimes magical place to work, most of the time pretty awful. Most of the time you can't see your hand in front of your face, and it's not particularly pleasant. People, I think, assume that we're working in and around rigs, and we do that quite a lot. We might inspect the welds on rigs periodically, or we'll be bringing risers and caissons and conductors and pipe work basically up into the rig. But the vast majority of the infrastructure, certainly in the North Sea and mostly in the oil industry, actually exists on the seabed. So that'll be the wellheads, the pipelines, and basically the electronic and hydraulic infrastructure, which allows us to pump oil or gas out of the ground and bring it back to the shore. So our job really is either putting that in, inspecting it, maintaining it, repairing it, and increasingly these days taking it back out again. I keep promising myself I'll take these pictures out of the presentation because, quite frankly, I don't know who they are. I don't know where they're working. I've never been anywhere like that because that looks really pleasant. I think what I was trying to explain was it's quite a varied job. So there are days when you might be welding, you might be doing fairly intricate electronic or hydraulic work, and there's also days when you can spend 6 hours honking sandbags around the seabed. So it is pretty varied. Right. This is what you've all come for, isn't it? Okay, so the incident on the Topaz, which is the vessel you saw earlier on. This took place, as I said, the 10-year anniversary just passed a few weeks ago. On the 12th of September 2012, we were working at a place called the Huntingdon Manifold, which is about 90 miles east of Aberdeen. That pretty much puts you in between, most of the oil fields in the North Sea run between the UK and Norway, if you know your geography. And we were 91 metres, or there you go, I've done it for you, 275 feet down that night. We had about a 35 knot wind and a 6 metre swell that night. Now that sounds, certainly when I wrote it and when I read it out, quite bad. And it's definitely approaching the point at which we might decide not to dive anymore. It's sort of fairly marginal weather, but if you're going to work somewhere like the North Sea, as I explained, that sort of dynamic positioning system which holds the vessel in one place is incredibly effective. And you need to be able to work in those conditions, otherwise, frankly, you would get nothing done. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that that wasn't a cause of what happened, or what I'm about to tell you about. It wasn't a cause of what happened, but it definitely exacerbated it to an extent. Sea temperature at that time of year is about 4 degrees, which I normally say to people is cold, but that's probably nothing to you people. What are you moaning about, sort of thing? And we were diving at about 10 o'clock at night, which actually for us on the seabed has no real relevance because very little light penetrates to that depth anyway. But for those on the bridge, as I come on to the story, they basically had a catastrophic failure of this dynamic positioning system, and it shorted out all the screens on the bridge, and they were in complete blackness. And we were nowhere near anything. We weren't near an oil rig. We were in completely open water, so they had absolutely no frame of reference on a dark, stormy night to be able to orientate the vessel really apart from their compass pretty much. So an extraordinarily difficult proposition for them. This is for whenever I do it in the US. You guys know where this is, don't you? There we go. Crowd pleaser, that one, wasn't it? Yeah. For us, it was that night, however, a normal day at the office, as much as I suppose it ever can be in the North Sea. We were working within this Huntingdon Manifold, which was actually pretty open. Often access and egress into structures that we're working within can be quite tight. There's a lot of pipe work, but that one was pretty good. Visibility was pretty good that night. We could see the diving bell from where we were working, which is very unusual in itself. And we were doing a pretty routine job.
And basically, you see your A and B. We open in and closing them in a sequence.
We were removing a section of pipe work, essentially. I was doing some pressure testing. My colleague, Dave Uwasa, was just a few metres away from me. As you can see, starting to remove bolts and nuts from just a section of pipe work we were going to remove. Pretty normal work for us, this kind of thing we do day in, day out. So there was definitely no inclination or indication, certainly, of what was to come that night, until, as it says on the screen, until we heard the alarms.
And then it started. I saw alarm which I never seen before. Immediately after this alarm, more faults coming one by one.
So for us, hearing alarms is not actually an unusual thing. As I said, we have this constant open line of communication to our dive controller, who that night was a guy called Craig Frederick, who is a Canadian. So we normally have his dulcet tones in our ears, sort of reassuring us and telling us what to do. We can also hear everything in the background, which is normally people telling others how much better of a diver they were, and how they'd have done it quicker and faster in their day, and so on. But we can also hear the alarms. So we have various alarms going off, carbon dioxide alarms, O2 monitoring alarms, things like that. And also when the other bell was about to be launched, you can hear them testing the alarms from the dynamic positioning system. So it's not unusual. So when we did hear them, they were obviously a bit louder than normal. We definitely pricked our ears up, but it wasn't panic-inducing particularly. But very quickly after that, Craig started telling us in no uncertain terms that we needed to make our way out of the structure. I don't recollect him telling us what the situation was, but you could just tell from the tone of his voice, from the way he was saying it, but this wasn't a drill. There was. I don't think I knew what, but something was clearly a problem. But even at that point, we didn't really panic. And as it says there, we made it relatively.
So I wanted my divers back on the bell as quickly as possible.
Get out of the structure, boys. Ring the bell, target. Come up on diver 1, diver 2, spike when you can. Stand by to come up on diver 1 and diver 2. No problem.
So again, this is all actual footage from the night. You could see Dave there making his way out in front of me. And you could also see the umbilicals in those pictures. And we really, seems a little ironic saying this now, but we really preach what we call umbilical management in our business, which is that, that, as I described, that umbilical really is everything you need to survive, in this pretty inhospitable environment. So we, particularly when we're coming in and out of structures, you would always make sure that's in your hand, so you know where it is and it's not being caught on anything. Because even in a structure like this that was nice and open, you can still see bolts and pipe work and valves and fittings where you can very easily catch your umbilical. So, but as you see there, we made maybe I think within 30 seconds we'd made our way out of the structure and dropped our way down to the seabed, and fully expecting, having come out, to see the diving bell where we'd left it straight in front of us, but slightly disconcertingly it wasn't there. I think even then I hadn't really calculated what was going on. I don't think. You're just sort of blindly following your umbilical, because that, again, coming back to that 4 days of decompression, the same applies really in terms of when you're down there, there is only one safe haven that you can go to. So if you were to make an uncontrolled or a bolt for the surface, basically in a panic, you would die very quickly of explosive decompression, as those gases just ruptured tissues and blocked arteries immediately. So it never crosses your mind. It's not an option. The one and only safe haven you have is the diving bell, and your route back to the diving bell always involves following your umbilical. So it's a pretty simple task. But for us that night, instead of them being sort of nice and straight in front of us, where we'd left them, as we exited the structure, we found that they were wrapped back over the top of our heads and over the top of the structure that we'd been working within. So again, without thinking too much, we turned and started to climb them. Craig was definitely telling us to do that as well. Duncan, who's up in the bell, the third diver who's up in the diving bell, he's pulling he's being asked to pull the umbilicals in. He can only do one at a time. He chose Dave. You'll have to ask him why. But in truth, it wouldn't have made much difference, because you need two hands to climb something like that, to pull the weight up. So I sort of climbed hand over hand, and as I got to the top of the structure, I turned straight away to sort of make sure that my umbilical wasn't going to get caught on anything. I'm going to show you a bit of footage of that happening in a minute, because that's what does happen, obviously. I feel it sort of belies a little bit the speed at which it actually happened, because it sort of looped a little bit just for dramatic purposes, I think. But literally as I turned to sort of address the problem, I saw it sliding up underneath what was a transponder bucket, which is basically just a metal outcrop on this structure, which I'll show you in a minute. But it happened so quickly, I was really genuinely powerless to do anything about it. I'll come to it later, but I've had a lot of sort of introspection since as to whether I could have done anything differently, and I think that's one thing that would have stopped me going back to work if I felt I was culpable in some way, but that's probably something I'll have to wrestle with forever. But I don't really think there's anything I could have done about it. It happened so incredibly quickly. I sort of dropped down to try and free it straight away, but I realised very, very quickly that the chances of my getting it off were pretty much non-existent. But again, I actually will let someone more eloquent than me tell you this time.
Structure, boys.
When I was nearly at the top, I noticed that Chris didn't seem to be going any further. I could tell something was wrong.
Chris had a loop of umbilical wrapped around his outcrop. He was trapped. It started to get tighter and tighter. I've never seen an umbilical this tight. Chris could see the tension in it. He was asking for slack out of the bell. He couldn't get the slack out of the bell because the ship kept moving away.
Chris, we cannot give you any slack.
Up on the bridge, as I sort of touched upon, they'd suffered this catastrophic failure of this dynamic positioning system. This is a system, along with all the life support systems on our vessel, which has multiple redundancies. So there are 3 computers. There's the computer, there's the backup, and there's a backup to the backup. And theoretically, they're never supposed to be able to fail. The first one fails, the second one kicks in, the second one fails, the third one kicks in. But one of the many lessons we learned that night was that they never assumed that a single point failure is impossible, because that's exactly what had happened. Their screens had all gone black. They'd had to try and transfer. They had to wake the captain up, which, if you ever caught sight of him, is a brave thing to do at the best of times. Get him out of his bunk, and he and the first officer had 2 joysticks each, and they were trying to control the vessel manually. For me, down below, I remember my first concern wasn't really the umbilical itself. It was the fact that as it was wrapped underneath this transponder bucket, because obviously this vessel now, whether we've lost that dynamic positioning system, is pretty much at the mercy of the wind and the waves, and is starting to move away. We only have 50 metres of umbilicals from the bell to the diver. So once you reach 50 metres, it's going to start pulling you, obviously. I remember that it was, as it was wrapped around this transponder bucket, it was still slipping, it was still moving around, and I remember thinking that if this carries on, I'm going to be following that through a pretty small hole, and it would be, equivalent to being pulled through a cheese grater, which is not really my chosen way to die, I don't think. Yeah, it would have been very unpleasant, obviously. I can also remember my legs being splayed and thinking they were going to break, and thinking, that's probably going to hurt as well. And then eventually, I'm obviously pleading with Craig to give me some more slack out of the bell. But then after a little while, almost like a jack being pulled out of a speaker, I'm guessing internally the power cable must have snapped or broken or stretched beyond the point of being functional. And suddenly I lost all communication. And that was the first of the, let's say, seminal moments, but that was a very disconcerting one, because you suddenly feel very, very lonely, obviously. You haven't got somebody shouting at you to get back to the diving bell, and I wasn't able to shout at anybody to help me out. Suddenly you feel very much on your own in an environment like that. Thankfully, one of the first doses of very good luck that we had that night, because we did have a lot of enormously good luck despite the sort of initial bad luck we had, was that the umbilical stopped slipping. So that was reassuring. It wasn't reassuring at all. It was just slightly one less thing to panic about, to be honest. But no one was more aware of that tension than Duncan. Oh, sorry. That was supposed to be dramatic effect. I've got to show you this first. This is the structure before it went in the water. So my pointer, you can see that's the sort of offending transponder bucket. So that's what I got caught around. So I'd basically gone up this side of it. My umbilical was basically like that and off to the side there. Yeah, that was supposed to have been taken off when I installed it, not that I'm blaming anybody else.
Chris's umbilical went so tight that it actually started pulling his stainless steel umbilical rack off the wall. I was shitting myself. was literally waiting for the inevitable, just to all go through the hole in the floor. And if I got between it and the hole, I would be going out with it.
Yeah, sorry for his bad language. He's from Yorkshire. He can't help it. So difficult times for Duncan. He was obviously worried that umbilical was just the rack was going to rip off and drag him down into the water as well, which wouldn't have helped anyone, obviously. For me on the bottom, the next thing I lost was the gas hose. So I think, again, that must have stretched to the point where gas couldn't pass down it. And very suddenly I didn't have anything to breathe, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is not great. But that's not something we train for quite regularly as divers. We don't recommend it, but it's not uncommon to turn somebody's gas off, for a laugh. Mostly when we're training, to be honest. That's not something that's encouraged at work, really. But we do that to practice, because what we do carry are emergency bottles on our back. So we call them bailout bottles, but they really are just an emergency supply of gas. And when you sort of suddenly sense you have nothing to breathe, and it doesn't take much encouragement, you just open a knob on the side of your helmet, which opens the flow of gas from these emergency bottles into your hat. But that puts you in a very, very different place, but I'll come to that in a minute. Dave's going to describe it to you in a minute again, but we had this sort of strange cinematic moment almost, because he similarly is being dragged away by the vessel. He's only got 50 metres of umbilical, but when he turns and realises I've got a problem, he's trying to get back to me, but because the vessel is already just over 50 metres away, he's unable to do so.
We're maybe less than 2 metres apart. The visibility is good enough that we can look into each other's faces. I can see that he's in trouble. But that's now me at the end of my umbilical. And I can't get to him. His umbilical is getting thinner. I can hear it creaking. It's the noise that something makes before it breaks.
Makes me jump. I don't know about you, but I don't actually remember the umbilical breaking, or certainly don't remember the sound of it. Dave described it like a sort of shotgun going off, pretty traumatic sort of noise. But yeah, we had this strange moment where he was sort of flailing, trying to get back to me. We couldn't speak to each other because my communication had been severed, but I can definitely remember looking him in the eyes and saying, come on, mate, give us a hand. And he pretty much looked me back and said, you're on your own. I'll see you later. And he was dragged. I remember him being dragged backwards into the darkness, and I lost sight of him, and I could just see his light. And then as he's dragged further away, the light disappeared, and he was eventually just, he disappeared, never to be seen again from my point of view. He himself was in no small amount of danger. He was being pulled off this structure by the vessel, which is continuing to move away. And, there's all sorts of structures and things down there for him to catch himself on. So he had to turn really and save himself at that point. There was nothing else he could do for me. Because the tension has been released on the umbilical, after it snapped, and I was sort of spread-eagled on the side of the structure at that point almost. I fell backwards. I heard mention of a turtle backstage again, so it was very much like that. I was on my back, like a very much an upturned turtle. And I can remember taking a couple of seconds really to say, where one of those "where am I again" moments, in shock almost as to what had happened. I can remember the darkness being absolute, like nothing I'd ever really experienced before or since. That I would put my hand in front of my face plate and literally couldn't even see the shadow of it, just complete and utter darkness. But I took a couple of minutes, really, just to a couple of seconds, I would say more to gather my thoughts, and then even then I don't think I had appreciated what was going on. But your survival instinct kicks in, as I'm sure it would for anybody in this room. And all I could think about still was just getting myself back to the dive and bell. So the thought process I think was pretty much non-existent, to be honest. It was just an instinctive thing to think I need to get myself back to the structure, and I need to get back to the top of the structure. Up would seem to be the way to go, and I'll find the dive and bell and I'll get back to it. So I sort of scrambled to my feet in a slightly ungainly fashion. and realised that I didn't know where the structure was, despite it being, the size of a house. We're talking about something about 10 metres high and 20 metres long and painted yellow. And I couldn't see it. So I had another massive dose of good fortune in that I sort of put my hands out in front of me as though, like you do when you go into the toilet in the middle of the night, and set off really in hope more than expectation. And after a couple of steps, I was lucky enough to bump into what I assumed was the structure, because even as I was touching it, I didn't know what it was. But that was a good start. I remember being frightened of losing it, and I remember sort of edging my way along it, keeping a foot and a hand in contact with it at all times, looking for a way to climb it. Most of the structures that are down there are sort of covered in pipework and stuff, but as you just saw it there, this was quite an open one, so there was no obvious way to climb up. We normally have a buoyancy jacket, which we could inflate to sort of give us buoyancy from the seabed, because we're negatively weighted most of the time. But my method of inflation had been severed along with my umbilical, so that wasn't an option. I remember having my sort of arm out in front of me to protect myself from what I didn't know was there, but eventually I bumped into what turned out to be a pressure testing hose. So we'd been using a 2-inch rubber hose all the way down from the ship down to the seabed into the structure, which we've been using to test this pipework we were taking off. And because the vessel had moved away in an uncontrolled fashion, they'd had to sever this on the surface. So basically 100 metres of hose were lying in the water over the top of this structure. So I gave it a bit of a pull to check if it would take my weight, and lucky enough it would, and I was able to climb up to the top and get myself back up to the top of the structure. And when I talk about seminal moments, that was definitely the biggest one for me, where I got to the top and for some reason fully expected to see either the diving bell in front of me or Dave or Duncan or somebody on their way back to get me. But I looked up and there was nothing. There was nothing but utter darkness, utter blackness in the sea above me. And that was a moment that I knew I was moving from what was obviously a slightly scary situation into what felt very quickly like a life-threatening one. Problems for me on the bottom. Duncan, who's up in the bell, doesn't really. I'll come back to 0 minutes in a minute. No, we're not telling you about it now, sorry. 0 minutes, I put that on the screen really because I talked briefly about the, that infinite supply of gas that we really have coming down an umbilical normally, and there's enough gas on the ship to keep you on the seabed for weeks if you really needed to be. But once that hose was severed and I'd opened that bottle on my back, you move into a world where you have very much a finite supply of gas. So if you have seen the film, or if you do watch it, it makes a big deal, Hollywood style, of being about 5 minutes. But the truth is it was probably nearer to about 9 minutes if you do the calculations properly of gas in those bottles. But nevertheless, not very much. So yeah, the beginning of difficult moments on the bottom, and Duncan still has to pull the umbilical in, not really knowing what's going on.
I was hoping I was pulling Chris in, but in my heart of hearts I knew I wasn't. I knew there was nothing on the end. Hot water hose came in first, broken and tattered at the end. And I had another couple of wraps of umbilical to pull in before a broken end of his gas hose came in. Now that is making quite an immense noise. I put my hand on the regulator to turn it off. Never, ever turn a diver's gas off when he's in the water. It's tantamount to killing him. I did feel as though I was letting Chris down. That was the end of his lifeline to the bell. I could have cried at that point. I didn't know whether to be sick, cry, whatever. I just shouted, "I've lost my diver, I've lost my diver." And I didn't know what was happening today, so I had to be sensible and pull myself back together.
Tough for Duncan. For me on the bottom, I can remember my maths is pretty poor at the best of times, to be honest, and in that situation it's definitely no good. But I can remember doing some rough maths and thinking, I maybe have 7, 8, 9 minutes of gas in this bottle on my back, and I've probably used 4 or 5 of that just getting back up to this position here. Had Dave been right in front of me, ready to pull me back up to the diving bell, I remember thinking, even if he was right there in front of me and dragged me back, the margins in terms of time of getting me back to the bell and my helmet off and me back into a breathable environment were going to be very, very fine. But with nobody there in front of me and no sign of anybody, I quickly realised that, the chances of getting out of it were felt almost non-existent. And whilst that was a depressing thought, it was also had a strangely calming effect on me. Because I think that panic, and people often say, "Oh, you were very calm," but trust me, I wasn't calm. There was a lot of panicking going on. But at that point, that sort of almost subsided in me. I almost felt it sort of fall away. Not because I'd lost hope, because I was definitely hoping, but because I really didn't think there was any realistic chance of me being able to save myself or being saved. So I did make a conscious effort to try and regulate my breathing, but I think mostly it was an unconscious thing where the body just, and the mind says, your time has come, you need to sort of accept this almost. So, yeah, they were the sort of beginning of some very emotional moments for me on the bottom, which I'll come to in a minute, but they were also emotional for Duncan up in the bell.
I knew Chris, I knew Morag. I was wondering how we're going to explain it to that we went on a dive and he never came back. Yeah, I was struggling to contain myself.
I think you mentioned earlier that he was worried he was going to let me down, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard anybody say ever, I think. There's no one less likely to let you down than Duncan. He's a truly lovely man. If you've seen the film, he's exactly as he comes across, really. He was a bit of a father figure for me during the infancy of my saturation diving career anyway. We'd spent a lot of time together, so it was difficult for him up there. For me on the bottom, I remember almost assuming once I'd sort of craned my head up so many times to look for any signs of life or light, I almost took a fetal position up in the middle of the structure, sort of dug my fingers in and lay there really in hope more than expectation. It was almost sort of like a regression, really. We've all got that little boy or girl inside us somewhere, haven't we? We spend a lot of time trying to pretend we're otherwise or grown up. But in that kind of situation, I felt myself regress back. I didn't quite put my thumb in my mouth because I couldn't, but metaphorically, I think I did, and wondered how I'd found myself in this ridiculous, lonely, ethereal, dark place, and how on earth was this going to end up being my resting place, But as I said, the panic had subsided, and the emotion really which swept over me the most was that of was grief. I think is probably the only way I can describe it, which sounds maybe slightly sanctimonious when I'm stood here, particularly considering the company we're keeping this evening, in front of you, healthy and well. But that's what it felt like. Grieving, I don't think particularly for myself, although I definitely didn't want to die. But I remember worrying desperately for the people I was leaving behind. I don't really like to harp on about this generally because I feel as though people are given notional death sentences every day, certainly through cancer diagnoses, and God, we know here today, don't we, that people suffer terrible trauma and loss all the time, and it doesn't give me I don't really feel I have the right to preach about it. But it was this unusual situation where I had what felt like just a few minutes to contemplate my impending death, and so naturally, I think your thoughts turn to the people at home. I was at sort of a pretty exciting time in my life. I was about 32 and I was getting married the following year. I was literally physically in the process of building a house. I had hopes and dreams for the future, children, a life well lived, a rich life well lived, hopefully, and it felt as though that was all about to be ripped away from me in an instant in this strange and alien environment. I can remember thinking of my mother and father being told about this, or my fiance to be, or my fiance, sorry, indeed, being given this information and the devastation that was going to cause. I remember even apologising. I think I shouted out in the darkness, I'm so sorry, Morag. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry that I've put myself in this position, almost taken a selfish decision to pursue this career. And I've put myself in the firing line, and I'm about to pay the price, and you're about to pay the price, more importantly. I can also remember entreating Duncan to come and save me. I called Duncan's name out a few times, almost begging him to drop out of the sky and save me, or drop out of the sea and save me like he always did, which made no logical sense. It was going to be Dave who was in the water with me, but for some reason I thought of him. So, yeah, difficult emotional moments. Like I said, I don't think I'd given up, but it certainly felt that way, and thankfully those above me, they hadn't.
But at no point did I allow myself to think that we weren't going to get him back. Definitely not. There was no way where I was going to go home and explain to Morag that Chris wasn't coming back.
The final moments are quite difficult to describe. I can remember thinking it was taking a lot longer than I thought it would. The gas seemed to last a long time, whether that was just whether I lost track of time, which is quite possible, or I'd regulated my breathing sufficiently really to make that supply of gas last a bit longer than we maybe thought it would, or I thought it would. But eventually I do remember the breathing getting a bit more difficult, and that's a sure sign, if you've ever experienced it scuba diving, that you're about to run out of gas. And I remember thinking, this is it, here we go. I hope it doesn't hurt. I hope my hat doesn't flood up. And I remember really not wanting to drown. I didn't want that to be the way I went. But the very final moments, I usually describe it as you went to bed last night, you had a cup of cocoa or golden syrup or whatever it is you drink at night. And you were looking forward to coming to this today, and you had a little think about things, but that final moment when you fell asleep, or you effectively passed into unconsciousness, you don't specifically remember, and it was very much like that. If you want to look at the physics, which I'm not really going to do today, but it's probably the carbon dioxide build-up probably overcame me before the actual loss of breathing gas, but we'll never really know. But it wasn't an unpleasant. I hate to say way to go, because obviously I didn't, but if that was the way I do go eventually, it wasn't a terrible way to go. And I get people contacting me all the time, sort of asking me, what it's like to die, which seems like a bit of an unfair question because I don't have the answer. But I sometimes try and offer them that as reassurance that it's not always necessarily a terrible thing. But eventually I did pass into unconsciousness. Put 9 minutes up there. We'll never really know because we didn't have any way of documenting how long it actually took. But my part in the story really is now finished. As I said, I'm just, what I say all the time, I'm just a damsel in distress, really. Now, the vessel at this point is nearly 250 metres away, so the weather has pushed it that far away. So with Dave, with his 50 metres of umbilical, obviously can't get anywhere near me. But what we did have in the water that day was what we call a remotely operated vehicle, which is basically a flying camera with a manipulator arm on it as well. And that had a nearly 300 metre long tether. So eventually that was able to get back to my position, even while they were struggling to control the boat. And I'm going to show you a bit more of this footage. This is sort of the harrowing thing you saw at the beginning, and that was footage from the ROV. And I show you that really not to try and scare you or anything like that, but just to show you a couple of things. What looks like maybe a water line in the hat there. So we always wonder why I didn't drown. We have an oral nasal in there, but it doesn't sit tight to your face. So that seems slightly unusual. And then obviously there's this sort of twitching motion you can see, which some people are thinking maybe I'm waving, but trust me, I wasn't waving at anybody. I'm very much unconscious at that point. But yeah, we talked about that oxygen toxicity. I mentioned that at the beginning. So that's been cited as a potential reason for that. But the main reason to show this really is because this footage, is obviously quite difficult to watch for some people. You maybe see 30 seconds of it here. For those on the vessel that night who were woken up, crowded around screens watching this, it's sort of piped all around the vessel, 110 people up watching this. It goes on for nearly 35, 40 minutes, so a long, long time, and that twitching that you see there eventually stops. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma towards the end. But yeah, what we found that night or subsequently was that those people who had to witness that almost suffered as much, if not more, than we did, really. Watching a colleague and, hopefully for at least one or two, a friend dying on a seabed or supposedly dying must have been a very, very difficult thing. So up on the bridge, they continue to try and search for a solution. As I said, they were trying to control the vessel manually. That manual system, is only really designed to nudge a vessel into a quayside wall. It's not designed for use in that situation. And the truth is, they were struggling and not managing. The yellow line you can see there is the path they took, and as you can see, it's pretty uncontrolled. But eventually they decided to solve the problem with, the crew are Norwegian on the ship, and they call this the Swedish solution, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, in that they turn the computer off and turn it back on again. So I don't know what the equivalent is in Canada, but yeah, the Swedish call that the Norwegian solution apparently. But yeah. I'll preempt a question, because we're not really doing too many questions at the end, but I'll preempt one. People always ask or wonder why they didn't do that earlier, why not do that straight away? The reason for that was they had this manual control of the vessel, which wasn't really working, but they did have it. And they were worried if they just turned the computer off and tried to start it up again, but they would lose that as well and be left completely adrift. But eventually they realised they weren't going to be able to get back to me in any other way, so they did it, and thankfully it worked. But the problem was that by the time they'd done that, 35 minutes had passed between the severing of my umbilical and the boat regaining control. But once they have done that, they were able to move back to my position using the dynamic positioning system. And as it says there, finally there was a Herculean effort involved, because Dave is now close enough to be able to get to me. They lowered the diving bell down to just a couple of meters above the structure, and he's able to come down and get me. And again, this is the real footage from the night. You can see him come down. I talked about that hose. We have a hose to inflate our jackets to give us buoyancy. So the first thing he does is take his off and push it up the seal. So we have a sort of latex seal on our neck to try and give me a supply of breathing gas. Again, one of the many little things that may well have saved me that night. He checked that the umbilical wasn't caught on anything, and then he hooks himself into me with a sort of a rescue lanyard. So he's attached to me. And begins to pull me back up to the diving bell. I'm about 6'5". I weigh far more than I should do, and Dave is a really fit guy. He's sort of a rock climber type, very lithe, lots of upper body strength, and he struggled immensely to get me back. You'll see the motion of the vessel, those 6 meter waves that we were talking about as the boat moves up and down. They were making it extremely difficult for him to pull me back. And he said to me himself that if he hadn't been able to haul me onto the little stage beneath the bell on his last attempt, he was at the point of exhaustion, and he was going to have to let me go down to the seabed, just drop me to the seabed and start again, basically. So yeah, phenomenal effort. One I can obviously never sufficiently thank him for. He's a very unassuming, quiet, dedicated professional, and he's not sort of a media junkie like me, stood up here. But the true heroes of the story, as I said at the beginning. Everyone looking upset, but it's all fine. Eventually, he did get me back up to the stage. He then feeds me back into the diving bell. So once he's done that, the hole in the bottom isn't that big, so he has to sit and wait outside. He can't get in as well. He just sees what looks like a dead body hanging there. And Duncan, who's in the bell, is then able to take my diving helmet off and he gave me 2 rescue breaths. Now, I talked about trauma briefly there, and we as a 3 who are in the water, we generally, unless we're maybe repressing a bit, I don't know, but we don't feel we suffered any trauma that night. But this is a recreation, and I would say the only trauma I've suffered in the whole thing is having to do that 20 times over. It's a lie. It was lovely. But yeah, literally, he gave me two rescue breaths, and apparently I exhaled very violently. A real like that. and started breathing straight away, which, obviously was, I don't really like the word miracle, but it certainly felt miraculous, I think, to everybody involved. I was then actually able to, I don't remember coming around particularly, maybe a few flashing lights and things like that, but I was then eventually able to climb up into the bell myself, under my own steam after 3 or 4 minutes, I think, and sit down on the chair in the diving bell, at which point Dave was able to get in as well and close the door and start the process of bringing us back to the surface.
I decided that he was more than likely dead. I think I'd started to come to terms with the fact that he was dead and that
Thanks,
we'd
Dave.
recovered a body.
Cameras back.
I got into the bell. I could see Chris sat down there, and he was definitely not dead. That was very confusing.
I genuinely love Dave, but he has got a way with words, He described it to me at some point. He said, obviously I was pleased to see you, Chris. He said it was like, losing your kids in a supermarket. Happy to find them again. Pretty pissed off I lost you in the first place. Yeah. So there we go. They're then able to, as we're coming back, I was, I don't know if you spotted that in our poor makeup in the sort of, that was a recreation, the resuscitation bit. But I was very, very blue. Duncan said he couldn't tell if it was the cold or just cyanosis, But my lips and head were very, very blue. So they very gently warmed me with hot water as we came back to the chamber system. As I said, that takes about 40 minutes. So they had a bit of time to gently warm me. And I've put there, again, I've used the word miraculous, so I'm not very keen on that. But I always feel that to be stood here in front of you obviously does feel slightly miraculous. It sort of defies explanation to some extent. But for me, actually, what seems more miraculous, and maybe only because no one's been brave enough to tell me otherwise, that I didn't suffer any kind of brain damage. You would assume that would be the first thing to go. Yeah, I was a bit of a savant before this, but yeah. As I said, they gently warmed me with hot water on the way up. When we got back to the system and locked back on, they sort of lowered me down on the rope. I don't think they fully trusted me to climb down. And when I got to the bottom, there was nearly said a gaggle of diver, but we call it a whinge of divers. That's the collective term. Who were waiting there, and they stripped all my clothes off and carried on warming me with a shower, which thankfully didn't make it into the film. They decided I was suffering from shock a bit and I might need an IV line in there. They couldn't get it in, so they decided I didn't need an IV line. But I was, essentially I was fine. I was vomiting a bit. I felt very tired, after the the shock of it all, I suppose. That sort of 4 days of decompression, one of the big problems with that is that we have to be very self-sufficient in there in terms of our capacity to deliver medical care, because getting a doctor to us is quite difficult, particularly when we're out at sea. They need to come out in a helicopter really, or we need to sail in, so it all takes time. So we've got tens of thousands of pounds of medical equipment in there. We're all given just enough training to make us dangerous. But they swear that the thing that saved me that night, and this is a very English thing, was the tea cosy they stuck on my head. So that's about maybe an hour and a half, I think, after I got back. So looking a bit bruised and strangely pleased with myself, I would say. But ultimately well. So this is a toughie, really, explanation of survival. I've been lucky enough to tell this story at British Medical Society and hyperbaric conferences and all sorts of things. I've never really had any concrete answers, lots of theories. I'd always assumed it was the cold water. I mean, you guys up here in Canada probably know more about this than me, but you hear stories of children in particular falling through ice and surviving for very long periods of time as their body is cooled. I talked at a perfusionist conference recently, which are the people who cool the blood during open heart surgery, and they basically hibernate the body whilst they do that. So I sort of assumed it was probably something like that, because I would have been very, very cold very, very quickly in that situation. I've since been told that actually you need to get your body temperature down to about 32 degrees for it to be in a protective state. And if that was the case, then they wouldn't have been able to resuscitate me that far. So 2 breaths would not have brought me round. It would have been a much slower re-warming process to bring me back to consciousness. So I'm sure it helped, but I don't think it was the thing that really saved me. And I think it's more likely it was this, which is the gases. That's why I bored you senseless with the gas lessons at the beginning. Really was that, that night I was breathing 6.9% oxygen when we were diving. And then I had 10% oxygen in my bailout. And as I said, that's obviously very little here on the surface, but at that depth, it's equivalent to breathing well, maybe 4 or 5 times the level of oxygen you would be on the surface. So I think that effectively saturated my tissues, over time, that sort of filled the very cells with oxygen just sufficiently enough to keep me alive, But these are very much theories, and if you've got a better answer, I'd be absolutely delighted to hear it. Okay, I'm nearly done. You'll be glad to hear. So just really to finish and to tie in really with what we've been talking about tonight, I'm just going to go over a few reflections. The first few I'm not going to bore you with really because they're more related to the lessons that we learned, practical lessons. Because strangely for us, we viewed it ultimately as a success story, I suppose. We obviously suffered this single point failure of one of the systems, but the response that the diving team put in and my colleagues in particular, obviously, the way they followed their procedures, the chains of command, the drills that we do all the time, all these sort of kicked into place and allowed them to. One of the most remarkable things I've listened to is the audio footage from the dive control and the bridge during all the emergencies, and it's so remarkably calm. People are unflustered, worried but unflustered, and they're just in a very calculating fashion going through the processes they need to do to effect a rescue. So, from our point of view, we were pleased with how things went from that thing. So we did learn a lot of practical lessons, silly things I won't bore you with, but what concerned us most about that was the fact that we hadn't learned those lessons before, because we do drills all the time. We do a diver rescue drill, for example, all the time, and there were things like Duncan didn't have a knife. He wanted to cut my equipment off, and he couldn't reach a knife to cut it off and stuff like that. Lots of little lessons we learned. And we realised really that we weren't doing our practice drills, same as you might do a fire drill in your office. You go through the motions sometimes, don't you? And we'd been doing that a bit too much, we found, and we really tried to change our approach to that thing and the whole culture on the boat of practice and drills and making sure that people participated actively, really engaged in them and try constantly to evolve and improve what we were doing in terms of our safety standards. But that's all pretty dull. From a sort of more personal point of view, obviously I'm stood in front of you, and so I hope it's reasonably obvious that I didn't die that night. But it did feel like a glimpse, maybe, of what might have come, and I think in some ways it's given me a more acute sense of death. And when as I said, I've spent time with the Dahl family and with people this week who've suffered terrible tragedies. It gives you a bit of perspective, and I feel slightly inconsequential, but it did feel like a glimpse of the other side. And what I realised was, in those moments, I didn't really, and this is not because I'm not a selfish individual, because I really am, but your thoughts turn to the not to the trivialities of life, not to silly things like, I've got to I won't be able to pay that gas bill next Thursday, or, they turn to the people you love. It seems obvious and self-evident, but that really is where it falls to the bigger, more important things of life. And that's really, I would say, the one thing that stuck with me through that, or after that experience, was, to reflect more carefully on what I prioritise in my life and what really is important to me, and the joys of this existence we have. Because, as I described, I felt as I was about to be robbed of all these wondrous things, because I really feel that life is wonderful, through the good times and the bad. That rich tapestry of existence is one to be cherished. And that was sort of drilled down to me that night. I think that was about to be taken away. I probably talked about this already now, so I'll probably skip it. But the one thing we did notice that night was, again, I think because the three of us in the water were able to affect our own rescue. We had our destiny in our own hands, I suppose. And we extricated ourselves from this seemingly impossible position that we almost came out of it with a sense of euphoria and a greater confidence in what we did and what we do for a living. But strangely, a lot of people had to witness it who were effectively powerless to do anything about it, and had to watch that footage, in real time. that the death of a colleague would have had profound implications for them all, professionally and personally. I'm sure it would have scarred everybody. But many of them, we lost several people who decided they couldn't work with divers again, or couldn't work in the offshore industry again. A lot of people had sleepless nights. So it's just a reflection on how trauma of any kind doesn't necessarily just involve the people directly affected. It can really spread to a wider audience or a wider community. An epiphany, so that's one again I get asked all the time, and again I feel slightly ashamed about this, that I think people do assume that you've had a moment, and as I described there, I think I do feel like I've had a slight shift of emphasis in my life, but nothing more than that. And I think the reason for that is that ultimately I'm fine as well, but reality bites, as I said there. You still have to go out and buy milk on a Tuesday and put the bins out. It has a way of taking over, and you forget. You do forget, and you do move on. But it's important, and again, that's one of the reasons we're here tonight, isn't it? It's important not to forget. For us, mostly in a professional capacity, we need to never forget the dangers we're involved in, and never to get complacent. But it's also, as we all know here today, very important to remember and cherish people we've left behind. I think that's it. And I never put quotes in my presentations, ever. I don't really like it. I'd rather speak for myself, but I've done it tonight. And I was going to quote Descartes or something like that, or Molière, to try and sort of give you the impression. That's what giving quotes is about, isn't it? Making you look clever in other people's words. But I went for a Scottish one because I come from Scotland. So, and that's just something I feel is very true. That dying is easy. It's, that can sound like a flippant thing to say, but we do all die very, very easily. Life is extremely fragile, and it's the living that's the hard part. I know we've got a lot of young people in the audience today, and lots of evidence that life is very, very difficult and can be overbearing on people. And I don't expect this little presentation to change anybody's life in any way. I would never presume anything like that. But hopefully it gives you, for me, it was an insight into how joyous life is in a strange way. Out of sort of seeming tragedy came, a bit of enlightenment in terms of how great life is, and how we have to embrace it and fight it. And whilst it must be very, very difficult, life can be difficult. We have to make the best of it, and try and enjoy it. And then a final one you'll be very glad to hear from one of my favourite authors is that death is certain, and that's was touched upon earlier tonight. It's an unfortunate reality that we are all going to go. And this is a philosophy I think I live by, and I would encourage you to take home with you tonight, which is that life on this earth, with all its mystery and beauty and pain, because there is plenty of all of those things in life, is therefore there to be lived far more intensely. And I personally do agree with that. I don't want anything more than that. I want to experience it all, the ups and the downs, and we don't have any choice. That's the other thing. So there we go. I'm going to finish on that, and I'm going to finish by saying again, thank you so much to all of you for coming to listen to me. Or listen to us, I should say, and to celebrate Emily and remember her. I hope I haven't bored you too much, basically. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I don't know which one's mine.
Wow. We're just going to get set up very shortly here, quickly for the Q&A. Or actually, are we doing this now, or are we having Tom come up? No. After, okay. Okay, so you can, and please approach Chris after, if you can get him away from the cheese table, and ask your personal questions. We came up with a few that he gets asked all the time, and he answered the big one that I heard a lot. He's 6'5". So the first thing I thought about after seeing the documentary was, why saturation diving? How does that career path actually happen?
I'll take that one. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I'll be honest, I think I prompted you on that question. I've realised I don't really have a very good answer for it, because I should really make something up. Dave and Duncan, because it is a career that I don't think people I certainly didn't know it existed until I sort of fell into it. And but Dave and Duncan were very different. Dave was a sort of scuba diver out in Thailand, passionate about that. Duncan was of a slightly older generation who enjoyed Jacques Cousteau and all that kind of thing, and grew up with the wonders of the underwater world. And they both found a way to make their passion, their vocation, I guess. But for me, that wasn't the case. I was sort of lost in my early 20s, didn't really know what to do with my life. Because that is a difficult thing, isn't it, for young people, I think, to know, if they haven't got direction, and I didn't have direction, what life's going to bring. So I just got a summer job, literally, on the back deck of one of these boats, and I got to see the divers firsthand, and that was it for me. It was a sort of, that was an epiphany, I think. That was one where I thought, that's what I want to do with my life, and, found a way to pursue that. And I think they probably turned up in fancier cars, which might have been a driver, I hate to say.
So Sherman, what prompted you? You saw the documentary. Lots of people watch documentary and don't call the person in it. What prompted you to do this?
Yeah, I guess, Katie and I are big fans of Netflix, so we watched quite a few things, and I saw this title, Last Breath, and so I clicked on it, and I mean, obviously, I was quite astounded by just the whole story, but I guess ultimately there was, I've often thought that existence was kind of odd. And I think someone asked me, I get this a little more often the last couple of years, or have you always been so philosophical? And I said, well, only since birth. And, and then different things happen over your life, but I thought, one of the most interesting things I've thought about lately, and I have to thank Lori a little bit for opening up about this yesterday with me and Stan. I finally asked her, I said, what Evan might have been doing on that bus, and she talked about that last breath, and of course I think about that a lot with Emily. Anyway, one of the things I thought, existence is kind of odd, which is different than even, and one of these things I had is, what would it be like to go to sleep and never wake up? It's kind of like waking up after never gone to sleep is kind of like being born. And what's the source of all this? And when I saw Chris, lying on the bottom of the ocean and talking about his experience of it, was kind of okay. It really caught me, and it seems to have brought out this ultimate compassion in you, and caring for people and helping them. So I just felt that's kind of who he was, and I thought, I got to talk to this guy. And he kind of, we did our first Zoom call, and I was like looking at him like he was like a cartoon character. And I'll never forget, because when you're going through this, at some point you gotta drop the, why am I phoning you?
Yeah.
I said, well, we lost our daughter, and right away he said to me, Sherm, I can't imagine what you've gone through. I looked right back at him and I said, Chris, I can't imagine what you've gone through. And so once we had that initial Zoom call, I just thought, would you come to Vernon? He said, sure. Does that answer your question?
Simple.
And here we are. Finally, Chris, how soon did you feel like you were ready to go back to work? And what did your loved ones think of that decision, and how did they support it?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question, especially when we're talking about families and things this evening, aren't we? So we went back, they closed us down for obvious reasons for about 3 weeks, the government health and safety executive. And then we were given the choice, really, whether we, as a team of 3, whether we'd like to go back and be the first back in the water. So we said yes, and I don't say that of any kind of bravery. It's principally because I can't do anything else, really. But it was also a sense of we wanted to get back on the bike and that kind of thing. And ultimately we felt fine and untraumatized. But 10 years down the line, and I look back on it, and I look back on the person I was then, and I've aged a bit. I've got 2 kids now, and I hope I'm slightly matured slightly, and I realised I was probably a bit blasé about that, and that was a selfish decision in many respects, because I don't particularly remember consulting people at home, and ultimately they're the people who suffer, and certainly in my situation in terms of being powerless to do anything, and often being powerless I think is almost worse than being in the heat of things, being unable to do anything, which I'm sure you're sort of familiar with. So whether I would make the same decision now, I suppose the point I'm making is I'm not so sure. I'd like to think I would be more sensitive and take more time to consider those around me. Yeah.
Very good. This just came to me. Were Duncan and Dave in your wedding party?
Dave came, yeah. Duncan came, beg your pardon, yeah. I think he says in the film, he couldn't buy a drink all night, but Dave, ever the professional, went to work, yeah. I did invite him.
Well, thank you for your presentation tonight, and to do that properly, I would like to call on Tom Wilkinson to come say a few words prior to the wine and cheese.
Thank you, Kevin. Before I express my gratitude to Chris, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge Emily. Emily's birthday was yesterday, and she would have been 22 years old. Our angel Emily is here in spirit this evening. Her presence, her contagious smile, her fun-loving laugh is only a thought away. I still have a vivid image burnt in my mind and heart of Emily, be it her tenaciousness and determination on a volleyball court, or her laughter and fun while crossing a small river in Belize wearing 2 different flip-flops. I always remember her laughter, her fun, and her carefreeness. Emily was a beautiful person. She's a beautiful soul. Also, how about a shout out to Avery and Emmy for their opening dance performance entitled Hope. Such creativity and beauty depicted hope, supporting a friend in despair and bringing her to the light. Thank you, Avery and Emmy. That was wonderful. I would like also to acknowledge Katie and Sherman, who are instrumental in founding the Emily Dahl Foundation. Sherman stated, Emily taught us that all along there is something tremendous within us, and we did not recognize it. Emily will live on in our hearts and minds as we recognize her goodness and now her legacy of bringing hope, compassion, and love to all. So thank you for that, Katie and Sherman. So on behalf of the Emily Dahl Foundation, I would like to thank Chris for sharing his amazing story of survival. And just even the pretext of that, I really enjoyed the educational piece. I didn't expect that. So thank you, Chris, for that. So when I watched the documentary, and then I listened to Chris tonight, and when he knew he was in trouble after his umbilical cord was severed and everything went dark, he had to act quickly. First of all, he turned on the emergency gas pack, and then he had to find or feel his way back to the platform. I love the story of how he climbed up onto that platform in the dark, in the bottom of the ocean. It was amazing, the strength and the courage. But the other thing I realized when he was telling his story is that he surrendered into the moment. And there is something, it could be his higher power, it could be something, was with him. And it guided him when he most needed it. At that moment, Chris had to trust himself and listen to his intuition. Through instinctive thinking, his actions, and obviously the good training he had, somehow he knew he could get on to the top of the platform because he knew he would then have a better chance of surviving. So the one thing, and that was the power of what happened, is Chris never gave up. And so once he was on that platform, he had some time to reflect on his life, and he also knew he had to conserve energy because he knew he only had about 9 minutes in that pack. So at that time, again, he was then able to go within. He became like that turtle that Sherman said. He found that strength, courage, and hope to hang on, not knowing that he would be rescued alive. And meanwhile, his mates, led by Craig, Duncan, and Dave, did not want to lose him. And the ROV spotted him on the platform, and the light, and when they saw him, and when they saw that little movement or twitch, I don't know if that was really just a wave or the swell of the ocean or underneath the water, but it gave them renewed hope. And they as a team had such incredible strength of character, of love and determination, and more importantly, your trust. They did not panic, but went to work to rescue you. What happened that day demonstrated our incredible capacity for deep love, for deep compassion, for deep generosity, and our capacity to do selfless good. To lay on that platform 90 meters below sea level without gas and heat, and to survive after more than 36 minutes without either, is truly remarkable, demonstrating the resilience of the human spirit and love. So where is Chris? I have a presentation for him. Well, there you are.
Sorry. That was very lovely, by the way.
You're welcome. First of all, when I saw Chris lying in that the living saturation chamber after his rescue, I couldn't take my eyes off of that teapot cozy because it reminded me of the tattered tartan one my mother used to put over our teapot. So I was down at the mall the other day, and I couldn't find a proper tea cozy, but I know that Chris would love this Hudson's Bay toque, and this will keep his head warm. Chris.
Thank you.
For you?
Thank you so much. I better put it on, look.
And finally, Chris, on behalf of the Emily Dahl Foundation, here's a token of our appreciation, a beautiful eternal knot mounted on a nautical chain. Very fitting for this occasion.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That's very kind.
So thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really kind. Thank you. Thank you. That's beautiful.
Oh, we have one more thing. You want to do the intro into the, what is it? The video, sorry.
Well, they didn't give me any answer, okay. But,
well, I got one last thing.
Okay, thanks.
So one last thing, we actually have a video, so please sit back and relax, and I know you're going to enjoy this. Thank you.
And just prior to doing that, well, actually, we'll do it after because we need the lights up. We have that lovely Destain print that we want to get to you on the 50/50, but we'll do that after this presentation. So please sit tight, and then we'll get to the wine and cheese.